Welcome to Fantasy Cartography, the show where we see what maps can teach us about fantasy and what fantasy can teach us about maps. On today's episode, we're going to look at the news, by which I mean the north, the east, the west, and the south, although that isn't actually the etymology of the word news. Here's the first question for today. Is our Western idea of the compass, the cardinal directions north, south, east and west, objective or subjective? The answer, it's objective because of the rotation of the Earth. North and south point towards the north and south poles, east is the Earth's direction of rotation and west is the opposite of east. These directions won't hold in outer space, but they work fine for the Earth's surface. Most societies throughout history have more or less recognised that same compass. The ancient Chinese and Japanese believed in a fifth direction towards the centre, but that isn't actually objective. You can express it in terms of the other points. Some Native American societies treated up and down as cardinal directions in addition to the other four. Those directions are objective relative to the Earth. We can express them as being towards or away from the core. But when we make a conventional paper map for navigational reference purposes, we're mostly interested in covering a large area of land. So we represent elevation with symbols instead. It's worth considering the compass bearings of non-spherical worlds. In Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, the cardinal directions are still objective. They are hubwards and rimwards, towards or away from the centre of the disc, and turnwise and widdershins, with or against its rotation. This creates what's called a polar coordinate system, which draws a series of circles. This system is incidentally also really useful if you're trying to map a solar system or a galaxy. But these directions only work because the Discworld rotates. On a flat, stationary world like Narnia, you can't really make sensible compass bearings. East and west do make sense in Narnia because the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but the only objective definitions for north and south are the right angles to east and west. There's no special reason to use right angles either. You could build an equally good coordinate system using 60-degree angles, or a polar system like the Discworlds. My theory would be that Frank, the first king of Narnia, and C.S. Lewis himself, applied English ideas about the compass directions without really thinking about how they would apply to a flat stationary planet. And, in sci-fi news, ring-shaped planets, Dyson spheres, and donut-shaped planets don't have an inherently sensible set of compass directions. It depends on how those planets rotate around the star they're orbiting. A donut-shaped planet could have directions defined as towards the hole and away from the hole, but the other compass bearings would be dependent on its rotation. The other interesting question about compass bearings is which one to put at the top of a map. In the Western world, we usually put north at the top, a north-up orientation, but there's nothing inherently correct or superior about that. The north-up orientation became popular in 14th century Europe, when explorers were developing better sailing technologies and setting off on adventures full of colonialism, slavery, and genocide. Since the compass was so important to open sea navigation, it made sense to use one of the compass directions, either north or south, as the orientation of your map. But why choose north-up over south-up? Probably because of Eurocentric racism. A north-up orientation puts Europe top and centre, up above Africa, which reflects the ideas about the hierarchy of races that were used to justify colonialism, slavery, and genocide. Now, I'm not saying that we need to stop using the north-up orientation. There isn't really any way that you can make a map which is both apolitical and useful. A south-up view of the world just comes off as a post-colonial reaction to the usual north-up, while maps without a clear orientation, like this icosahedral map by Buckminster Fuller, aren't practical for everyday navigational use. But it is worth acknowledging that the north-up orientation that we're used to in the West is not the only way to see the world. In more practical news, it is worth pointing out that not every map needs a cardinal orientation. The United Nations logo is a map of the Earth centred at the North Pole. This depiction of the Earth turns the compass into a Discworld-style polar system. North or south are towards or away from the centre, east and west run around the circles. This kind of mapping on a smaller scale is very practical for depicting Antarctica, since most conventional maps can only show it as just a big splodge along the bottom. Some traditional Asian maps used a similar projection, putting the capital at the centre of the map and arranging the rest of the country around it, which might explain why they treated towards the centre as a cardinal direction. This kind of map isn't easy to navigate using standard cardinal directions because they'll be distorted based on exactly where the centre point is. For a more modern example, look at Leonard Gelk's projection of the world centred on Toronto, Canada. It does have one useful feature, which is that it makes it very easy to measure exactly how far any point on the Earth is from Toronto, which I suppose may have been another reason that those Asian countries favoured a capital-centred projection, but it runs into a lot of other practical problems, among them that a conventional compass doesn't really work. And of course, as with all things in cartography, cultural criticism sometimes has to take a back seat to graphic design. One of the best examples is the island of Manhattan. It's basically standard to depict the avenues in New York running directly up and down, and the streets running directly left to right. This makes it easier to read on the go, and it lets you fit Manhattan onto a conventional piece of paper. On the other hand, the Western world is so used to thinking of north as up and south as down that some New Yorkers actually think the avenues run directly north-south. If you look at the map of Manhattan in a larger context, say on Google Maps, you'll discover they actually run closer to northeast-southwest. I don't think this highlights any really important biases in global society, but it does tell us that it's worth looking at maps in a critical way. One of the most famous examples of a non-conventional orientation in fantasy mapping is Thror's map of the Lonely Mountain in The Hobbit, which uses an east-up orientation. This orientation also owes itself to graphic design. Tolkien's early sketches were drawn north-up, and he only switched to east-up when he realised that this would make it easier to fit onto the page. Later editions of The Hobbit added a note saying that the east-up orientation was usual in dwarf maps, but Tolkien never actually seems to have provided an in-universe reason why that was the case. It's actually pretty rare for any fantasy map to use an orientation other than north-up, even when there's no good in-universe reason to favour the north. Most fantasy maps exist for the benefit of the readers, not as in-universe objects, and the north-up orientation is a consequence of this. People in the real world are very used to north-up maps, so we use north-up maps in our fantasy as well. You do get some odd consequences from this. The maps in the Dragon Age video games use a north-up orientation, but they don't provide an in-universe reason for it. Maybe the country of Tevinter, which once ruled most of the world, pushed for a north-up orientation to put themselves over their subjects, and maybe that tradition stuck around even after their empire fell. But in the game's present day, Orlais is the seat of most international leadership and scholarship. I would expect that Orlais would favour a south-up or even west-up orientation to put themselves above their rivals in Tevinter and Ferelden. Of course, there are out-of-universe reasons why Dragon Age is mapped with north at the top. One of them is familiarity. People in the Western world are used to the idea of a north-up orientation. The other reason is that, well, when you turn the Dragon Age map to a south-up orientation, it's kind of obvious that the map is based on medieval Europe with the pieces shuffled around a little. And granted, that isn't an uncommon technique, something you'll notice if you do a vertical flip of the map that I use for this channel's cover art. So, if you're a fantasy writer, what lessons should you take from this? Well, I think it's pretty simple. Don't use a north-up orientation just because it's what you're used to. Think about where the centres of power and learning are, and why certain parts of the world might favour different map orientations. It's entirely possible that rotating your world 90 degrees might make it look fantastically novel, even if it is just Europe with the names filed off. That's it for this episode of Fantasy Cartography. Please stay until after the credits for the unrelated, interesting fact of the day. Please subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon, and like this video if you learned anything. The full script, including references, is available on fantasycartography.tumblr.com. You can ask me questions with the Tumblr Ask box, or by following me on Facebook or Twitter, or by shouting at your screen, now! If you think I've made any mistakes, or if there's anything you'd like me to expand on, then please email me at fantasycartography@iinet.net.au. Until next time, may your fantasy be cartographic, and may your cartography be fantastical. I mentioned earlier that Chrono Trigger is set on a donut-shaped world. This got to be big news on gaming websites last year, but I don't think many people understood it, so here's the explanation. On a paper map of the real Earth, if you flew off the eastern edge, you'd wind up on the western edge, but if you flew off the north edge, you'd wind up at a different point on the north edge. But in Chrono Trigger, and most classic RPGs of that era, if you fly off any edge, you'll wind up on the opposite edge. That can't happen on a sphere. The only shape that supports it is a donut shape. Bye! And there's no special use in